Mm-hmm. And I think that's the intent. So, yeah.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yeah, if
or-
Wayne shows up, we can go ahead and start.
Okay. Like to call a meeting of the Joint Airport Zoning Board to order. It is 4 o'clock PM on Wednesday, March 30th. The first item of business is to approve the minutes of the January 31st, 2022 meeting. Are there any comments or corrections to the minutes?
No.
Nope. Okay. If not, then a motion would be in order to approve the minutes.
I move that we accept the minutes from the January 31st meeting.
We have a second.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes of the January 31st, 2022 meeting. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Next item of business is to receive an update on the draft zoning ordinance and comments from the Minnesota Department of Transportation on that subject.
Mr. Chair, Brian Page from Mean Hunt will be presenting on this.
Okay.
Okay, for the record again, I'm Brian Page. I'm with Mead and Hunt. We are the airport consulting assisting the city of New Ulm with its zoning update. So, good news, I guess, to report to the JASB that we did get the draft program submitted off to MnDOT probably a little more than a month ago, and after our last meeting, and had a chance to actually get some comments back from the folks at the state who that had a chance to take a look at it and review things. There also, I think many of you probably know, but there is an ongoing planning process that is ongoing with the city as well to update its master plan / airport layout plan for the airport, which is more or less that comprehensive plan at the airport. So the meeting, we had a meeting. They requested that we do that, get together with them to kind of talk through things, and it all kind of plays together in a certain sense as far as the planning work and the zoning work is concerned. But one of the things right out of the gates that they wanted to point out to us is they saw and recognized and appreciated zoning for both runways, the proposed Crosswind Runway and also the existing primary runway. But the part that they took exception to was the existing turf runway. They said that they, because it is still an active runway and it's in the system, and because it is a NIPIAS airport that is in the national system, they're saying that they don't have the ability and they cannot approve or move forward with the planning process without having zoning or some level of zoning in place for the existing Crosswind Runway. So as we had kind of talked about as a group, we talked about this previously and about the idea and the planning that that runway would eventually be decommissioned and made into other usable space for the airport, with the idea that the new runway, the new Crosswind Runway, would already be in place and up and running, which is still the case, and that's still the overall plan. But what the state is telling us at this point is they would not have the ability to approve anything until they get zoning in place to follow statutory requirements on the existing Crosswind Runway. So the problem that we've been faced with that existing Crosswind Runway for a long time is there are some non-compatible land uses that exist out there today that don't follow the standards. Some of you remember from some of the previous discussions that we've had that show the trapezoids and the zones off the ends of any runway. Well, what's happening is some of those zones already have structures, particularly on that northeast end, have structures and so forth that are in the restricted areas, and that's hence been the problem. So kind of go through and talk a little bit about just what the ramifications of that and so forth are. But what we're hoping to do today is to really talk about those issues. And what the state has proposed that we do is follow the recently adopted zoning update standards, which were adopted in 2019 by the state legislature, which allows you a little bit more flexibility to zone for runway approaches that might be a little bit less than perfect, you know, so to speak, or might have some of those incompatible land uses in them. So that's kind of where we're at today. I kind of wanted to present that to the JASB, let them know, I guess, what the ramifications of it are, and we should probably talk through just some of the future, what that could mean or what that would look like going forward through the future. So with that, talk a little bit about things. I thought it'd be helpful if we needed to kind of refer back to the boundary here. We had that information that's in here that could show the overall plan for the airport, but this is kind of the bigger picture, as you see on your screen right now, showing the trapezoids that we had already did the zoning for, which are the future Crosswind Runway, and then also with the primary. And this sketch here, well, if I go back, I think many of you are aware, there is an existing Crosswind Runway out at the airport today that essentially runs more or less in that, you know, kind of northeast by southwest, you know, type orientation. It's a turf runway. That turf runway was built, near as we can tell by the historical documents, sometime in about the 1940s, roughly, about the same time as the primary runway work was done. And essentially the purpose of the Crosswind Runway, as many of you know, is to be able to provide a more enhanced wind coverage for the airport for aircraft in basically all weather conditions. The primary runway here is pretty good. It provides about 90+% wind coverage, so about 90% of the time the winds are going to be favoring that runway, which can be used. But it's that additional percentage of time that we're talking about that this runway doesn't, you know, provide that, and you need a crosswind in the direction where the winds are coming from predominantly, and that's how this runway came to be in the first place. So the new orientation for the proposed runway is more or less following this section line on this drawing and kind of coming in an orientation kind of similar to this. And that's, you know, essentially going to be a better wind coverage for the airport. Because again, you have to look at the prevailing winds and what direction the winds are coming from, and there's instrumentation that's based at the airport that monitors that. So we know which way the winds are coming from and what would be the ideal orientation, which would be more in almost a true east-west, you know, type of a orientation rather than. The other thing that does for you is allows you essentially to build a runway in this proximity here where there are no known or existing incompatible land uses. You're looking at zones that stretch out over the pit, the quarry pit over here, and essentially agricultural land. On this end, it's essentially agricultural land as well. The other advantage of this orientation, also it puts it right on the section line. So in terms of the property that would be needed to be able to support that new runway, you'd be taking a little bit on the corners or the ends of the respective landowners and not subdividing somebody's property. The question was asked when we got together collectively with the folks with the state and with the Federal Aviation Administration, well, why don't we do some reorientation of this runway and maybe slide it one way or the other? And again, we've looked at that. This is not a new, I guess, thing. We did a whole study on that several years ago. The airport commission at that time had agreed that the best solution was to put it more or less in this orientation. Not to mention doing anything with this runway. The only thing you could do is shift it further off to the southwest And by doing that, what you would do is this farm, essentially right here, would probably, a significant portion of it may have to be acquired because it would be in safety zones. Not to mention you'd be subdividing that farm. So my guess would be is in that process is, you know, it would probably be a very costly acquisition because you would probably end up buying the whole farm, so to speak. Whereas otherwise, that other orientation that we had talked about is much more advantageous. So we talked about that, and that's not the purpose of tonight's discussion, obviously, to get into that. It's more or less what the state is requiring, getting some zoning in place for the existing turf runway, understanding that it's probably a temporary type situation. It's probably not going to be forever. What it would be is it would allow them to approve not only the zoning, but also the planning work that is going through the process right now and allowing and meeting state and federal standards. So that's really kind of the purpose of it. And then when the new runway was built, what would happen is once that new runway is commissioned and it's able to be used, the old runway would be decommissioned and taken out of service at that point. And hence there goes development agreements that are out here that this area would be reopened, I guess, for any sort of development in the subdivision up there. It's currently on hold because of this, you know, this zoning issue. So with that, what I wanted to do is kind of show you what it looks like. There really isn't much to talk about. This runway 4, where this is this would be on that orientation, kind of visualize that east-west orientation that I was talking about. And this kind of extends off where the future runway, or I'm sorry, this is the actual existing situation, that this would be basically what it looks like off that runway 4 approach. And you'd be looking at, you've got your zone A, which is coming out, which is going to be 2/3 of the runway length, and then you've got your zone B, which is going to be 1/3 of the runway length. But in order to be able to zone for this, this is what that trapezoid would look like. We could keep it away from this farmstead to where there wouldn't have to be probably much clearing, although with the trapezoid coming in, when you're coming into this runway approach, would probably require us by the zoning maybe to take down the height of some of these trees on this windbreak he has. I don't think it would require taking them all, but there might be some tree cutting, topping that might need to be done, I guess, in that situation. The other end is where it gets really interesting.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
question, can you put the picture back up? Any other restrictions on the end, crop-wise, height-wise, what can be planted, what can't be planted?
Essentially, the use of that land could,
on the
you
microphone.
know, essentially remain the same.
Okay,
You know, the crops that are out there, generally speaking, they do want to see that you're not putting something that's going to attract wildlife. You know, something, you know, I'm not sure what is actually planted out there right now, but, you know, it doesn't look like this is any sort of taller row crops. Corn is always kind of a little dicey, but the lower, you know, crops, you know, soybeans,
there is corn planted out there.
okay. You know, I think that's, you know, something from that the zoning is really not the thing that's going to dictate that. That's really more of a Federal Aviation Administration standard for what happens at the end of that runway.
But nothing is restricted at the moment, is what I'm asking.
No, and the zoning is not going to change that.
Okay.
You know, it's not going to appreciably change any of this. It's really, the purpose of the zoning is really to kind of prevent any sort of additional, you know, non-compliant things from happening out in that approach. But what's been happening out there up to this point would continue to be able to, you know, I guess, you know, go on, I guess, for, in terms of, you know, any sort of impacts that the zoning might have.
Mr. Chair, board members, we did have a MnDOT safety inspection at the airport this last summer, and we, during that inspections, they did not note any items off that end of the runway as far as crops, with them being too close or anything like that, so.
Picture one more time. The little triangle on the where the number 4 is, down that triangle to the right, up just a little bit, that triangle right now, that currently is restricted what's planted there. That's why I asked that question.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's what, and when they were out there that day, that's what they would have seen.
Right.
So I was wondering if that's going to, and that's not even on the end of the runway, the approach area.
It's more on, yeah,
On the side.
on the sides.
So I was wondering why that is restricted there and not on the end. Any idea?
As somebody who's fairly new to this process, who is it who restricts what can be planted there? What, is that an agency, or how is that person informed, or?
It's MnDOT generally performs safety inspections, so the agencies come out and perform the inspections and let us know if there's encroachment, which.
I know you said
happens
that
every-
that wasn't something that would be dictated by zoning, but I was curious how, because they do fit in together somewhat.
Right,
Thank you.
Yep.
But again, just to be clear, that the zoning really isn't going to have much of an impact on that. That still remains, you
Correct.
know, the same, and that's more of a safety compliance issue, so. But
Okay, now, just following up though on Keith's question, why is that triangular piece subject to restriction from a crop standpoint, and the area directly off the runway does not appear to be restricted?
the area, the way to look at it is all runways are going to have what's called a safety area that's associated with it. And the safety area coming off a runway, a turf runway, is only 200 feet, okay? But from the edge and the width of that runway, a turf runway, you're looking at something that, generally speaking, they want that width to be defined as about 150 feet wide. And then there's a safety area that comes out from the edge of that. And what they want to do is make sure that any of the area out from that safety area is clear of any sort of row crops or anything that, again, would attract wildlife to come in there, or any sort of, you know, I guess, mammals, deer, whatever the case might be, that might be able to take up residence in something that a pilot can't see, you know, and it's all about safety. They even have grass cutting requirements, that the grass can only get so high in those areas as well. So that's something that Joe and I have talked about, and what we're planning to do this spring is to actually lay those areas out that are around those peripheries, to actually have like a monument or a marker out there to say, okay, this is as close as you can go from a safety, you know, compliance standpoint, how close you could actually go and plant crops to the edge of the runway. So.
Okay,
So yeah, it's, think of it more of a safety area, just as a matter of, you know, protecting, you know, basically any sort of users from coming in there and landing and having a deer or something go jetting out right from the edge of the, you know, the runway, essentially. That's kind of
so
what they're trying.
so it's not so much a concern about the height as it is about what might be in that location, an animal, or, and that they might then obstruct or go into the runway area and cause
Generally,
a
the
problem?
height is an issue as well, and it pertains to all runways, that the height comes in, and that's called a different kind of a surface, and that's called what they call a primary surface. And essentially, inside that safety zone, now you're talking vertical, you can't have anything that is taller than what the runway center line is at that transverse point. So like, say right here where the 4 is, you have to go out your safety area on both sides, and anything in here, any crop or anything else, can't be taller than what that point on the runway is. So that's where that's coming into play, about not wanting corn in there. But there's other reasons for wildlife attractants and harboring, you know, some other, you know, like deer or any other kind of mammal that you just can't see, you know, because they're in the corn rows. You know, that's the thing, you know. And nobody wants any accidents or anything out there, so you got to make sure that we are compliant. And as Joe mentioned, the state of Minnesota will come by all airports about on a cycle of about once every 3 years, roughly, and they'll take a look at the airport and provide an inspection report and various things that they see. They just want you to, you know, get these areas addressed and so forth, and that was one of them, is to make sure that that gets addressed in the future. And the way that we're going to solve that is to be able to mark those areas, get the stakes out there prior to the planting season.
Okay,
Okay?
any other questions? Why don't you go on then?
Okay. As I mentioned, this is the area that we kind of wanted, we'll probably spend the most time talking about. What our folks have done is had a chance to take a look at the areas up there on that northeast end of the turf runway. And this identifies all the properties up there that essentially would be a compliance issue according to the state statutes. So you can see that this has kind of been the issue all along, and as we've talked about and previously, that the city has gone through at least 2 other zoning ordinance updates in the years past. They've never zoned for that Crosswind Runway, and this is part of the reason why, because this is nothing new. This has been out there a long time. In previous years, there wasn't a real good mechanism to be able to come up with a way to customize this for a lot of airports, and it's not here, it's everywhere, even in the metro. You've got a lot of the metro airports that are, you know, this times 10. And that's always been the issue with a lot of the airports not going through the zoning process on a particular runway because you've got all these non-compliant issues. In 2019, there was an effort by the state to actually address this. And the way that they kind of looked at it is they say, look, we recognize there's a lot of problems with a lot of our airports and the system out there. But at the same time, we want to give a community a tool to be able to, I think the term was used, to stop the bleeding, I think is what Julie mentioned a couple of different times, to prevent anything else from getting built in these areas. Understanding that, yeah, we've got some non-compliant issues that we need to deal with. So for the very first time, what they agreed to do, and they put it through the state legislature in 2019, and they agreed to allow for making some exemptions on some of the existing land uses that are in these areas. And there's a couple of different ways that can be accomplished, and one of which is commonly referred to as an established residential neighborhood. An established residential neighborhood, what that means is you have a neighborhood out there that basically existed or pre-existed the zoning, the state statutory, zoning ordinance, or the statute from being enacted back in the 1970s. The neighborhood, the house was there first. So it's like, okay, the house and the subdivision was there in the first place. You can't retroact something and now all of a sudden have all kinds of non-compliant issues. So what they did is they allowed the established residential neighborhood exemption if you can demonstrate that any of those properties are residences and they were built prior to 1978. Same thing generally applies to businesses now. Businesses kind of fall under that same hat, if you would, of what they call low density, type of a building, particularly when you get out into Zone B. If it's low density, there is that persons, number of people to acreage ratio that we talked about at the last meeting and kind of went through that, and that's what they kind of used to apply that standard. The third thing, which was kind of interesting that they allowed, is they said, look, if there's an existing land use out there, and we're going to recognize that that's the fact, and we're going to allow the municipalities to be able to pass the ordinance and exempt those existing uses out there. And it's at your discretion to do so as a JASB. You can exempt some of those situations even if they were built after 1978. That would be at your discretion. But it's only in certain circumstances in certain areas. So if you look at these businesses that are out here, what we have proposed to the state is we recognize the fact that there's a lot of issues out here, and that's why this hadn't been zoned in the first place. So what the presumption would be is the color blocks that you see in this area, what we would be asking for in the zoning, should the JASB decide to move forward with that, we'd be asking for those properties to be exempt. So, and it seems that the direction from our conversation that we had with the agencies, they seem to be open to entertaining that idea, which would allow you to zone in that situation and exempt those properties. Now, the one thing that we did talk about is there's this big plot that's out here, and this is Helney Drive. I'm not sure what drive that is.
Airport Road.
Is it Airport Road? Okay. So there are some lots that are in this area here that are already platted. And as I understand, there's, kind of a freeze of any sort of permitting getting approved in those properties for the time being. And that would still have to remain in this situation. And there's other reasons why that would have to remain. Generally speaking, as long as this runway is still active, those properties would still have to carry that, if you want to call it a moratorium. I don't know if that's really the, what's in place here, but we'll just call it that for the sake of everybody knowing what that means. So in terms of, as long as this runway stays in place and the threshold for this end of the runway would be in this location, would have to be in place. And it's not just for the zoning. There's other reasons why that would have to be in place. One of which is, it's not shown on this particular sketch here, but there's what's called a clear zone. And then there's also from the federal side of it, there's what they call a runway protection zone, which are both trapezoidal shapes that come off the end of the runway. And coincidentally, it comes out and it ends roughly right about here. So those properties are still going to be in those zones, regardless of whether or not the JASB decides to move forward with this zoning, which precludes anything from being built there for the time being until that runway gets decommissioned.
Mr. Chairman and board members, so for the development of Sarah Hills Second Edition, that's the area kind of what we're talking about here. The city has a development agreement in place with the developer concerning these lots. And that development agreement also states that those lots cannot be built on until the existing Crosswind Runway is no longer in service. So we already have a local mechanism in place that is preventing the development of these lots. So by zoning it, it really doesn't affect the development of the lots, as we already have that local mechanism in place. So.
Okay, I do have a question though on, there are two single-family lots that front Birchwood Avenue, and they would be extensions of lot, or number 9 and number 10 to the, I guess, to the south.
Yep,
Lots, blank lots below
The
those.
blank, yeah.
Oh, the open lots, okay.
Okay, so those were platted at the same time as the other 5 lots that are colored. I can, they've been purchased, I believe, by adjoining property owners. I don't know what their, plans are, but, they, I assume that they think they have the right to develop those lots, at any time, as everybody else in that area has. And so I'm wondering how that issue would be treated.
Well, a couple of things. So these are the two that have residences on them,
correct.
Yeah,
and when approximately were they built?
well, what is it, number 10 says 1960 and number 9 is 1960, yeah.
Okay. So I would say that in terms of, I'm sorry, I should have probably just looked at the table, but both of these would actually qualify for the established residential neighborhood exemption.
I think we're talking about the empty lots. That's
Empty
still
lot.
within B. Yep. Okay.
So essentially, if the adjacent landowners, as I'm understanding, have bought those lots, and is it plausible that they could build on those lots?
Yes,
I would say that would be a decision that could ultimately be made by the JASB down the road, or the Board of Adjustment, I should say, once the JASB finishes up with this process. But I would think that a couple of different things, that these lots are actually in Zone B. So keep in mind, Zone B has less restrictions associated with it than what Zone A has. Structures are allowed, in that area, but there's a couple of caveats to it, that what they want to see is they want to see that the lot size of any sort of building in that area be a minimum of 3 acres. So I don't know the size of these.
No, those aren't,
Not.
they're not.
Acre lots, maybe.
Okay, so they're quarter acre, so they would not meet that
No.
3 acre, but what we could do, if there seems to be some interest in possibly doing something with those, it could be at the JASB's discretion to exempt those 2 lots as well.
And Mr. Chair, I might make a recommendation that all the lots along Birchwood Avenue are exempt, because there's the other 5 lots that are in Fair Hills 6th edition that are within Zone B as well. So I guess that'd be my recommendations. We extend the exemption to include those 7 total vacant lots that are within Zone B.
Yeah, I think that,
So
That
just to
would-
be clear, that Zone A, you said Sarah Hills, they knew that they were restricted on building when they bought those lots
Yep.
on Long Henley Drive. They were
Yep,
the
so
first.
the 3 that are empty, back when it was before my time, but when that development agreement was established, that developer knew those lots would not be developable until the Crosswind Runway was moved.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that was back in the early 2000s,
All right.
2005-ish, 2007.
yeah.
Now, some things that I kind of want to just make sure that the JASB has all the information. Again, as I mentioned, this is not a new concept about zoning for this area out here, and about the discussions of such, and about the Crosswind Runway in general, about relocating it. And one of the things that we have done in years past, I think the study was conducted back in 2016, roughly.
Yeah, so
There was what was called a Crosswind Runway analysis that was done to kind of take a look at all different options, put them all on the table. Do we move that runway? Do we try to relocate that runway, shift it one way or the other, all these different things? I think the analysis came up with roughly, I want to say 8 or 9 different alternatives that were looked at. The 2, kind of get right down to the brass tacks on it, that the 2 that kind of rose up to the top was, okay, we're going to look at doing something with the existing Crosswind Runway, and then looking at that as opposed to what the cost would be for developing a new runway, a new relocated runway where we talked about, that's more in that east-west, kind of an alignment. And what we quickly came up with is a matter of cost. The cost associated with doing this and having this be fully compliant and buy out all of those properties, and again, I'm just putting this out here as a hypothetical, that if the city decided to, okay, the runway comes first, the airport comes first, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna make this thing totally compliant. All of these other properties that are out here right now, we're gonna buy those and acquire all those, and then have it be like a green space area or what have you. Well, we looked at that, but the costs associated with doing that the improvements, because you already have this area all platted, you've got the utilities in that area, you got the infrastructure out in that area. So the cost of doing that per lot was gonna be pretty expensive. As opposed to, taking a look at the agricultural land that's out west and even to the east side of the runway with the new alignment. And we quickly determined that the cost associated with the land, one as opposed to the other, it's actually cheaper to go to the relocated runway location from a land acquisition standpoint. Because you're looking at, I think the last count is somewhere about 30 different properties would have to be acquired in this situation to make it fully compliant, as opposed to, I think it's about 8 or 9 on the other side of it if we did relocate that runway. So it'd be cheaper as far as the land cost goes, but obviously the cost of the improvements and the cost of the construction is gonna be more, because you gotta build a whole brand-new runway. You gotta do all the grading and so forth for it. So, but you're not looking at a lot. It's not a lot to build a turf runway in today's day and age. So, point being that, and this is the point that we raised with the agencies, is that the sticking where you're at possibility, because I keep wanting to go back to that. Well, why don't you just do that and buy all the properties? Well, that's a lot more expensive, and it doesn't solve the long-term needs of the community. You know, that relocating the runway does. But the sticky wicket that we get into is crosswind runways at all airports, and it's not just Minnesota, it's everywhere throughout the country right now, are really being looked at very critically by the FAA, certainly, and then also the respective state agencies. So there's not a lot of support out there to be able to build crosswind runways, particularly at general aviation airports, let alone even the bigger airports, the bigger regional airports that had scheduled service coming in and out. Those are even being looked at very critically about the FAA supporting their crosswind runways. Now, there's a big movement going on right now to try to get that changed, and there's a lot of lobbyists really lobbying on this thing. But the reality of it is right now is the FAA is saying your runway even here in New Ulm, it's eligible for funding. They don't disagree with that, but they're saying you can't justify it. And the way that they kind of set that bar very, very high, the justification to be able to get federal funding to be able to support a crosswind runway at an airport, a general aviation airport in particular, the bar is set so high it's impossible. You'd never get there.
Our general operations at the airport won't trip that bar. That's how high they set that threshold, so.
We deal with some airports that, say Rochester, for instance. Rochester could not meet that standard. That's how high that bar is set. So they had actually go a different route of classifying the runway in a whole different manner and calling it something else, and eventually we, got support for it. But, that's, just a whole nother can of worms. But nevertheless, the point being that it's not a lot, and the thing is, as the commission has talked about, and there has been some groundwork laid with actually getting some support to actually build a new crosswind runway, getting a political support to be able to do that. And that's probably what it's going to take. So once that happens, I guess, then this whole thing could go away. So I guess where I'm going with this is the idea that getting this zoned is not a popular one, but at the same time, the city should stay on that track about trying to get the new crosswind runway built, with the idea that this still is on a track to eventually be decommissioned.
Okay.
But it might take a while to get there.
Yeah, further question. Within those areas that have colored, there are existing buildings. If someone would, let's say this property is zoned for airport purposes, and someone wants to expand their building, is that permitted or not?
That'd be at the discretion of the Board of Adjustment going forward.
If we exempt them, then if those the colored parcels on the picture, if those are exempted, which we're proposing, then yeah, they can, because they're exempt from all zoning regulations at that point. Yep.
Thank you.
So to kind of get down to what we're looking for is we are looking for the JASB to accept this idea about moving forward, to be able to go through and retool it to actually provide the zoning on the other end using these exemptions, and as Joe had mentioned, adding the additional ones into the Zone B. And then what we would do is come up with that draft, the revision, and send that, resubmit that out to MnDOT. And the steps going forward would be is once they get that, they would get us back their comments. Usually there's some, minor adjustments and so forth that are necessary as a result of that. Once we make those final adjustments, then the next step would be is we would schedule that first public hearing. And what we would do is the JASB would convene, get the public, open it up to the public to come in to hear about the zoning, be able to make any comments to it. We address those comments. Then the next step would be is if there's any revisions necessary out of those comments, we make those. And then the next submittal goes off to the commissioner for their review and approval. So the state of Minnesota would actually, the commissioner would go through, do their review, and then provide any sort of comments and so forth, or approve the overall zoning. If it's necessary, there may have to be a second public hearing required, but that's not always the case. So if we had the commissioner's approval, then what would happen is it would come back, the JASB would convene once more to be able to adopt the final zoning and sign it. And once that's in, then it's in place.
Okay, you talked about the Board of Adjustment having perhaps certain rights to make decisions on what is permitted and what is not permitted. Is that something then that is written into the zoning ordinance, that authorization? Okay, thank you.
There is a zoning administrator, and the zoning administrator would really kind of have that first, that would be the first contact and basically the mechanism to be able to more or less be the enforcer of the ordinance going forward. But if there is any sort of a dispute or a request for a variance and so forth, then what would happen is that Board of Adjustment would kick in and they would have to actually render a decision.
Mr. Chair, is one thing I want to add. As far as going back to the zoning for 422, the city has no intentions to acquire any of the property for the zoning. The property would stay in the hands that it's in now. And we've made the agencies aware of that as well, that we don't want to acquire any additional property to a zone for this, and they seem kind of receptive to that. So just so the board's aware that even if we zone for it, the city is just zoning for it. We're not looking to acquire the RPZs or the protection zones or anything like that.
When you talk to the FAA and to MnDOT, typically how many people are you meeting with?
It kind of varies. Generally speaking, it is going to be probably the management, I guess, at both of those organizations. And then the way it generally works is they have a manager, and then they usually have a planning, type of person, or a planning program manager, if you would, and then a development program manager. And it's usually both of them that would participate in it as well. So, so we make sure that we're getting the right, audience, to make sure that we're getting some good direction, I guess, as to how to move forward. And this is not a new, thing to the agencies either. This has been something they've been fully aware of for a long time, and they're excited, that the city's going through this effort. But we're very uneasy about being able to approve anything moving forward that you still had an active runway that wasn't zoned. And that seemed to be the bone of contention that they were taking.
Yeah, there's a lot of history with this runway and the agencies. It goes back a very long time.
So is it correct that, at least in your opinion, that when you speak to someone from the agency, that what they would tell you about the airport in New Ulm is the same thing that they would tell you about the airport in Virginia, Minnesota, or in
Yes.
Fergus Falls, or?
Yeah, as far as applying things equally across the board, yes, they're pretty, pretty I guess, fair and equitable when it comes to that. And I can certainly see it, from, I guess, their point of view that, no, there certainly isn't anything that is out of the ordinary of what is being proposed here as opposed to anywhere else.
Okay.
The only thing different in that scenario would be the airport in location versus an actual town, maybe proximity, I guess, is one
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with this issue because of the proximity of the airport to New Ulm.
Right.
That's the reason it's coming up.
Right. And in the grander scheme of things, you're in a much better shape here than what some airports, I mean, think of some of the metro airports, ones that are in Minneapolis area, like Crystal, for instance, comes to mind, or Flying Cloud, that's out there on the southwest side of town. Those airports are in a very urbanized area, so they've got those kinds of issues times 10. So they're dealing with those on a different level of things, but it's, I think this is much more straightforward one to solve. It's a step we were hoping not to have to do, to be able to zone for that runway, knowing that we'd much rather, get support and be able to keep moving forward with the new Crosswind Runway, because that has made a lot of sense for a long, long time. But the problem of it is over time, the time passes and things change, different regulations come in, different people. We faced it all here. As Joe mentioned, this is not a new issue here. This has been going on for 20-some years.
Yeah. Yep.
So, it's been around a long time. But the state is very excited about, solving the issue and getting what they can live with, and they understand some compromise. That situation that we talked about here, this is not an ideal situation for them. And again, this could be something that might cause some consternation on the commissioner's behalf. I know that they're going to ask some questions, about the properties out here. But at the same time, this was the compromise that when Joe and I had met with the agencies, that we were able to say, hey, look, okay, this is kind of what we would need in order to be able to make this happen. And there seemed to be some willingness to be able to carry that up through their ranks to be able to get approval for it.
Even just a couple of years ago, this would have been a non-starter with the agencies. They would have wanted us to acquire that property, and but so I do see it as a good compromise, and that way we can get our planning documents done, our zoning ordinance done, and kind of relieve you guys as a board too at that same time. So
Absolutely. But this will be a good program going forward. But again, I would stress it's really not the JASB here to make the decision. But I would still encourage the city to keep moving forward and exploring the options available to it for getting that Crosswind Runway, the new one, built. To be able to find some funding support to be able to do it. It's going to take a little bit of maneuvering to be able to make that happen. I know some groundwork has been laid by the city to do that. I think they need to continue to do that, because the sooner that gets, kind of a plan, if you would, or at least an outline or a timeline associated with it, then we can really start looking at this runway and then opening up, potentially that area up there in Sarah Hills for future development, once that runway. And not only that, this area, as the airport continues to grow and get more people coming in and out of there, one of the things is the planning work actually shows this area is being developed for more of the corporate type or business operations at the airport. That area is actually laid out with what we like to call box hangars in the industry, which are more of a square, if you would, that really are only there to support probably a aircraft or two, but a single business, a single user that actually comes and builds that. Sometimes what happens is the city just leases the business, the ground below, and lets them build what they want to build, according to city standards, of course. But the other area that's basically north of the terminal building up there, as you all probably know, that area is more for the what we call T hangars, which are aircraft in each one of the hangars, multiple tenants coming, going. that sort of thing. So those are, you know, you usually don't want to mix the two uses because it creates all kinds of problems for geometry and safety areas and all that stuff that you need to abide by. So, but the point being that this runway being decommissioned would allow more of that future development to come. And we have been approached, you know, we've had some conversations with some users from the New Ulm area here, some businesses that have already expressed interest of building those types of hangars. And right now, we don't have a place for them to do that. So sooner the better that something would happen on that crosswind. But that's a discussion in a different context, so to speak, so.
Okay, so do you have anything more to, information
No,
to provide us with?
again, I just was gonna kind of bring up, the next steps here, just show the summary, where we've been, you know, the items that have been crossed off, so to speak. So this is the, things that we would have to do, to be able to, get to the final finish line. The goal would be is to try to wrap everything up by, as you can see here, the original schedule, which this little blip I don't think is really gonna set us all behind that much. But the idea would be is we'd wrap everything up by September of this year. And September is significant because that's the end of the federal fiscal year. And the grant that's actually supporting all of this work has to close this year by September.
Okay. In the federal infrastructure package that was approved by Congress, are there any monies in that for
Absolutely.
airport?
We explored that. It was kind of a little bit of a, you know, they were not able to support that, using that money to be able to build the Crosswind Runway. But yes, the city has been very fortunate. Essentially, the city is going to be getting $159,000 both this year and then also in 2023. And then the program is actually going to be reevaluated again next year about this time. And it'll either be at least that much or possibly more, depending on, you know, how the legislature looks at it and what kind of money is left over and so on and so forth. But the idea is that BIL funding is actually going to go out for a period of 5 years. So you would have 24, 25, and 26 that are yet to be determined what those numbers are going to be.
And so that funding would be used for airport operations then?
It would be mainly, it has to be AIP eligible, which is the development side of things. So any sort of improvements out there at the airport that are AIP eligible would be BIL eligible. So that's kind of the way to look at it.
Yeah, so we have more taxi lane areas that need to be reconstructed. Parking lot at the facility needs to be reconstructed. So projects such as that we've identified for future projects, fuel system, things like that. So.
Okay, thank you. So the action that you would like us to take today is to authorize revisions to the draft zoning ordinance and to resubmit that ordinance then to MnDOT.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think, yeah, with the zoning for the 422 alignment, with the noted exceptions that we've previously discussed, I think would be my recommendation. So that would be the depicted in the exhibit, those parcels, plus the parcels along Birchwood Drive that are not shaded but are within Zone B. The parcels within Zone A that we've discussed we already can kind of have that local control already. So by zoning this, we kind of check that box with the agencies. So that would be our recommendation at this time.
Any members have any questions, comments?
No.
I have two. First of all, you said that you thought this would be a temporary scenario, and you said the bar for FAA approval is set pretty high to obtain funding, so it's going to be most likely funding from another source other than them. Is that a correct statement?
That's correct.
All right, so how temporary of a situation is this going to be, is my first question.
I guess that remains, to be seen, I guess, as to what that's going to be. I wish I could give a better answer than that, but it really is dependent on, in some cases, political wins, so to speak. I know there was some groundwork laid by the city to be able to get some political support. The one thing I should probably say is that the political support, what I'm implying is that would be essentially a special funding that would be
Earmark
set aside,
funding,
or an
yeah,
earmark, if you'd want to call it that. That would be
They don't
set
call it
aside
that
for
anymore, but yeah.
that essentially the FAA folks, I guess, it basically sidesteps that process because it is eligible under their rules, so to speak. They're just saying that we can't justify to pay for it through normal means. And essentially what they're saying is there's other priorities out there that take a higher priority than us funding that. So we're never going to get to that because the bar, again, is set so high. So what a lot of,
And that's because it's a crosswind versus a primary runway, that
Correct.
are the two different,
correct,
so we're spending, or potentially spending a significant amount of investment for 10% use because of the winds.
correct. The other thing that kind of comes into play too, or in the fold that we've had this discussion with the agencies is because you have a crosswind runway,
Yep.
if you were to take that away and say, for instance, the city decided that, hey, the tax base and those lots and developing those lots is more important to us, we're going to do away with our crosswind runway. You could make that decision as a community and move forward with that. The problem that you get faced with now, though, is your primary runway does not provide the recommended wind coverage. Not only that, as a community, the community had a crosswind runway and took it away. Made the decision to do that, which could potentially lead to a liability issue. God forbid there's any sort of an incident or anything like that were to happen. But that's something that you would have to consider. Because it'd be different if the primary runway was able to support on the wind coverage analysis to be able to support the recommended wind coverage from the FAA, but it does not. So if you did remove it, it would definitely be a step backwards, and you would be losing something that has been there since, the 1940s or 50s, whenever that runway was built. So they're probably,
But I don't think we're talking, if we don't, a scenario, if this zoning that we're talking about does not go through, that's not going to decommission the existing runway. It's still going to be used. I guess what I'm trying to do is get a handle on what that time frame is. If we zone that, we're restricting people's potential uses of that property.
well,
And I understand.
these properties here are going to be restricted regardless of the zoning. As we talk about, there's other areas.
I
out
get
there
it, but
that
it's
restrict that.
it's supposedly under a temporary scenario with the potential of changing the new runway. And we just can't give them a time frame what that temporary is going to be.
Right, that's correct, yep.
And that was the whole idea about, zoning for that runway in the first place, because we're not sure what that looks like or how long that's going to be. I mean, and you've got zoning for 2 runways now that, when is that one going to go away? Nobody really can put a timeline on that because it's all dependent on getting that special allocation of funding, whatever that may be. So, again, it would be something to kind of keep the, fires going on that from a community standpoint to try to get some sort of support to build that runway. And we're not talking about a ton of money to do it. It'd be something to kind of keep the pressure going. But I don't think going through the normal channels, I think that's been exhausted at this point.
We have, as staff, we've met, prior to his passing, we met with Representative Hagedorn, and we've had communications with Klobuchar's office as well. So after the special election happens, that's one of our first things that we want to do is meet with our new representative and discuss this with them to see what trees we can shake to get the funding for the new runway. It's on the radar of Klobuchar's staff as well. So we have some irons in the fire. We just need to shake the right trees and hopefully things fall our way as far as funding is concerned for the new Crosswind.
There's two other communities, Minnesota communities, that has just gone through this very similar process. We talked about one at that meeting. There's another one that I'm aware of out there. But the avenue that they pursued is getting special earmark money to be able to do what they needed to get done. So it's not without precedence, even here in the state and even recently.
With 3 of us, is that sufficient?
Yeah, we're a quorum, and so we can take action. Okay, so if we are to take action, we would have to authorize the revisions, I guess, as presented, and then direct the staff to submit the draft zoning ordinance to the state. I guess I'd like to add one other item in there. I guess whatever changes are made to the ordinance, I would like copies distributed to
Certainly.
the members
Yep.
so that we can take a look at and get some understanding of what kind of impact
Absolutely.
we're looking at. If it's the decision of the group to proceed.
And
Yeah.
this isn't the final, this is just a
This is a draft.
draft, so we could still make changes in the future.
Absolutely.
So does someone want to make a motion, or are you ready to take that step, or do you want to
Well,
talk
am
about
I-
it a little bit more?
David, I just wanted to make sure that I understood this, because we're asking, we can take a motion on this tonight, but we also want to see what's going to be proposed before. So how do we form that motion?
Well, my thought was that they would submit this to us before they submitted it to MnDOT. And I guess if there weren't any concern on the part of the members that within a certain time frame, then that it would be
And we would forward it on.
forwarded to
Yep.
MnDOT.
And we could just do that by email. We
Yeah,
just,
do it by email.
if that's your wishes, we can certainly do that. Yep.
I think that's a good idea. That gives the 2 members who weren't able to make it
Yep.
today.
Right.
And I'll
option.
maybe provide a little more substance to my meeting minutes to kind of go over the discussion.
At
And
least they have an option to ask questions before it actually gets forwarded out.
Yep. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay? So I can move that we go ahead with that the revisions are dealt with and will be submitted to us first for discussion, and at that point can be submitted to the parties where it needs to be submitted.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good.
I agree with the motion. I'll amend it if we have a certain amount of time to look at them before it gets forwarded.
Yeah, board members, I was thinking a week to 2 weeks, I think, if that's sufficient for you.
Sure, 2 weeks is sufficient.
Okay, give you a 2-week window before it's, will that push your schedule back at all, Brian, or will that be?
No, that'll
okay.
be fine.
Okay,
No,
Okay. So we have a motion and a
I'll second it.
that we authorize the revisions, that we would request that the revisions be forwarded to the members of the board for a 2-week review, and that if there are no comments provided in that time frame, that the revisions can then be submitted in draft form to MnDOT for their review. Is that a correct statement of the, okay? All in favor?
Is it correct? Aye.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
Aye. So the motion carries.
Okay.
That would appear to be the, take us to the end of the agenda. Is there anything else that needs to be presented, or
Mr. Chair, I don't have anything else for the greater good today.
what kind of time frame do you think we're looking at as far as our next meeting then?
I would say the next meeting could theoretically be your
Public hearing.
public hearing. which I think timeline-wise, we were looking at, well, that's showing February, which obviously that's not gonna happen, so, you know, we'd probably be looking at, I would say, first part of May.
Okay,
Giving enough time, I guess, for notices to go out, because there's a process that you need to go through by state statute of who needs to be notified of this meeting. Individual notifications usually have to go out for any sort of Zone A and Zone B, and then it can be mass distributed or public distributed for anybody that's in Zone C, but everybody has to be notified.
Brian, do you think it'd be a good idea for the board to authorize us setting a public hearing date once we are able to set a public hearing date?
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, so that might be an action item. We don't know what that date's going to be, but if you would so wish, we could just authorize staff to set a public hearing date and send out notices when applicable after review from MnDOT.
okay, you have any comments about that?
I don't disagree.
Keith, any thoughts?
No.
Okay. Do you want a motion from us to that effect? or
Yeah,
would you
just so I can formalize it, I suppose we probably should, yeah.
Okay, so you would like a motion that would authorize staff, after getting a draft back from MnDOT that is determined to be acceptable and is to be reviewed by the public, that you can set a public hearing date. I assume you would base that upon contacting us to determine what dates are
Correct.
acceptable.
Yep, I would check
to
with you
us.
guys first prior to setting a date. Yeah.
And then you would, what kind of advance notice are you required to give?
At least 2 weeks.
Is
advance
2 weeks?
notice.
Okay.
We'd have to think about a venue for where that may be. Not sure how many folks would likely show. This might be big enough, but I guess we'd have to think about that. I'm not sure if somewhere else. I have seen many, many folks come out to these. Kind of runs the gamut.
Yeah.
So I guess that'd be something to think about.
Yeah, technology-wise and recording-wise, we're set up here, it's going to have to be here. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I expect that is going to be the case. Okay. So we have a motion. No,
No
I suppose we
motion
need
yet.
a motion.
Yeah, need a motion.
I move that we allow staff to, once they, to set a public hearing date, once they have the information back from our project, and send out notices, et cetera, after they have reviewed. I'm sorry, I'm not wording it very well. Let me try this again. I move that we can authorize staff to set a public hearing date, send out notices, et cetera, after the something.
The draft,
That review,
the
yep.
draft report is received back from MnDOT.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion. Any comments? Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries. So
Now
there-
we should be done.
now we should be done. Okay. We will close the meeting at this point in time.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.